and welcome to day 3 of the Global Cultural Symposium. And I have the pleasure of introducing this wonderful fellow, Gabriel Rin Berg of Israel. Gabriel is 50 years old. He looks about 25, and the father of 2. He was born in Argentina to Jewish parents of Russian descent. Gabriel grew up in Israel and has traveled the world. He has spent many years translating the Urantia Book into Hebrew, working with our manager of translations, George Michelson Dupont. The Hebrew translation is progressing towards completion, and it is already available in draft form on our website. Gabriel first found God inside with the aid of his guru and through his experience with tantric yoga and meditation. And he is surrendering to his Father's will a little bit more every day. As Gabriel likes to say, practice makes perfect. Gabriel.
So, good morning. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very grateful for this opportunity to Marilyn and to Claire and Marta and everybody else who's, Joanne, everybody else who's organizing this, Gaetan on the streaming. This place is still making history. It has made history and is still making history, and probably will make history for many years to come. So it's my first visit to 533, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. When I got the invitation, I was anxious. I didn't know what I was going to say, and partly because I don't really know much about Judaism. That was the truth. So it was a great opportunity for me to actually start to study and go back to my roots. And the first thing I did is ask myself a lot of questions. What is really that I'm interested in? So this presentation may not be similar to the others. It really goes through the line of the things that interest me about Judaism and I didn't know about. And I found quite a lot of things, and I'm still researching. And I'd also like to say that at the end you will see that, like everything else the Father does for us, it's always a sequence of steps, and it's like a mystery that unfolds. So today I know a little bit more why I'm giving this presentation. What is the next step that this presentation is a part of the sequence that leads me? And of course the translation of the Urantia Book was another step in that sequence. So I have a little bit more clarity about my next phase of service. To sum things up, because it really is going to be discussed in many details, I feel that I have the task to serve as a bridge between our Master Jesus and the Jewish brothers and sisters that I have. And my personal experience basically is preparing me to do this. And so this presentation is part of this sequence. So my hope is that this will help myself as well as my brothers and sisters of the Jewish faith to make the teachings and the life of Jesus and himself as a very special being on this planet more accessible to all of them. Have you ever wondered what Jews do on Christmas?
ay, 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 ay.
Listen to the last syllable. Anyway, for me this represents a little bit the similarity between Judaism and Christianity, and as much as I researched for this presentation, I saw that these are sister religions, but in many, many ways they're intertwined. And so even though, as I will show you later, the revelators tell us that the Jews really missed the point, I think there's still hope. And this is part of why I'm doing this. Jewish and Israeli, basically I didn't know what to present to you because I was born in Argentina to Jewish parents. I lived most of my life in Israel. So I'm an Israeli Jew. There's Jews that live in all over the world. So there are American Jews and French Jews. And so which culture am I supposed to present to you? And I'm not sure what to do, but I try to do a little bit of both. A little bit about Israel and a little bit about Judaism and Jews in general. And the combination, because I am myself am an Israeli Jew. So there's hope, I think. I hope I can convince you with that. Okay, we've seen that. So for me, I'd like to start with a little story that I think I told some of you this week about my journey into accepting Jesus as a creator son started intellectually when I started reading the Urantia Book. But before that, way before that, when I was much younger, the little cracks started to appear in what I think is a big layer of conditioning that Jews have against Christians, against Jesus as a representative of Christianity. And I was the first time I was in a church, I was 25, 26 years old. And until then I wasn't in a church. And it's not like because there's no churches in Israel, so there's quite a lot of churches. But I felt like it wasn't something you do. And I wasn't sure where this came from, this idea that you don't go into a church. But I was traveling with my brother in Boston, and then we were walking one Sunday, nice autumn Sunday, and we saw people going to a church, so we went in. I looked at him and said, yeah, let's do it. So we sat down, and we were welcomed by people we didn't know, and there was a beautiful sermon, and at the end of the sermon, the pastor said, why don't you get up and hug the people that are around you and just express the love. So we did that, and it was very, very different than the experience I had going into a synagogue many years when I was a child. I felt something different. I felt a connection, but that was it. So it was a little experience, a little taste. And what I'd like to start with is a very weird question. But as I was researching, that question came up. And the question is, does Judaism really exist? And it's a weird thing to ask because, we talk about Judaism as an established religion, but it turns out that this term, Judaism, didn't make a lot of sense to the Jews themselves until almost the 18th century, when other people were defining them as belonging to the Jewish religion, but that wasn't something that they did on themselves. They didn't say we belong to Judaism. They were just Jews. And there's a person called Daniel Boyarin. He's a scholar, an American Jew, that he wrote several books along the lines of examining Christianity and Judaism from the point of view of an American Jew scholar. And he found that until several hundred years after Christ ascended, Jews and Christians were really mixed together. It wasn't really a distinction. And only later, Christian scholars wanted to separate and then define Judaism as a separate thing. This man is Jean-Marie Lustiger. He's a French bishop. He was born Jewish in Paris, and at the age of very early age, he decided to convert to Catholicism, even though his parents didn't. It was something that he chose to do for himself, and then he ascended through the ranks of the church. And he's very high up there, and he says, I'm still a Jew. You know, religiously, I'm a Catholic, but ethnically, my parents are Jewish. I'm a Jew. So it seems like this, it's not a big difference after all, and that's the message I want to bring. So when you talk about Judaism, you really talk about many things in one word, and it's an ethnic group, like a family. You cannot really be kicked out of it. I mean, even if you don't practice the Jewish traditions, you're still a Jewish person. And some people consider themselves to be Jewish even if they have one Jewish parent, or even if they have no Jewish lineage whatsoever. They just feel affiliated towards Judaism. So it's quite an amorphic definition, what Judaism is. And in Israel, it's even more complicated, because if I show you my ID, it says my nationality is Jewish. So it's even more weird, like, okay, what is exactly Judaism? So I'm left with this open question. And what I want to impress to you is that until very recently, maybe 200 or 250 years ago, that concept didn't really exist until people started to, Jews themselves started to separate their religious affiliation from their ethnic and maybe political affiliations, especially when they were living in Europe. So this is really like an open question of the Jewish identity. And the next thing I want to talk about is, who is really a Jewish person? So I know I was born to a Jewish mom, so that makes me a Jewish person. But some people were not born to a Jewish mom and still consider themselves Jewish. So some people choose to be affiliated with the Jewish, let's say, tradition, because it's not a religion. They may not even practice the Jewish traditions. I don't practice the Jewish traditions, but I'm still considered to be a Jew. So for example, is an adult who has Jewish parents but who considers herself an atheist, is she a Jewish person or she's not a Jewish person? Just because she has the lineage. What about somebody who has Jewish parents but converted to Christianity, like the bishop that we just saw? He says he's Jewish, so nobody else can tell him he's not. Or somebody who has no Jewish ancestry but converted to Judaism and thinks himself or herself as a Jewish. So who is a Jew is also as amorphic as what is Judaism. And in Israel there is actually a law, because it's the Jewish state, and I will get back to that in a few moments. There is a law that says any Jewish person can come to Israel and become a citizen and get a passport immediately. But then they had to define who is Jewish. So the definition in the law is that a Jewish person is born to a Jewish mother or converted to Judaism and does not follow another religion. This is the letter of the law in Israel. But at the same time, the Pew Research Center has made several surveys within the American Jewry, and they also had to decide who they're going to talk to as Jews. So they came up with a different definition, and they said, we're going to take answers from people who either their religion is Jewish, by their own declaration, or aside from religion they consider themselves to be Jewish or partially Jewish, or they were raised Jewish or had at least one Jewish parent, even if they do not consider themselves Jewish today. So all these people go also into the mixture of who is a Jew. So if Judaism really exists, then this is one definition from the Habad Organization. The Habad Organization is a Hasidic organization coming from the Rabbi of Lubavitch from New York. They establish Chabad houses all around the world. So when Jewish people go to India, Thailand, Nepal, Dharamsala, it doesn't matter where, in the east, in the west, there's a Habad house there with a practicing Orthodox Jewish person. Usually they live with their family, and they just serve as a little beacon of Judaism. Like, they're not really missionaries. They don't try to convert anybody to Judaism. They just provide like a little house, literally a house, where many Israeli people that travel go there, and they have a Shabbat service together. They have a Seder, the Passover meal together. And it's like basically beacons of light around the world. So their definition to Judaism is this. The Jewish religion, this is what they call it, is defined as the totality of beliefs and practices of the Jewish people, as given by God and recorded in the Torah, and subsequent sacred writings of Judaism, which are quite proliferate. So this is their definition of Judaism. There are three major denominations: the Orthodox, the Conservative, and the Reform. They're very active around the world, but much less so in Israel, where the main definition is whether you're an Orthodox Jew, and most of the others are somewhat religious to secular. But the conservative and Reform denominations are present in Israel, but not as much as they are around the world in Jewish congregations. So now I'm going to switch a little bit to Israel. And there's a question mark in that graphic, because there's really a big tension between the concept of a state being Jewish and democratic. And Israel is already 70 years old. It was founded in 1948, so 71. And it's trying to walk that balance between this and that. And to my opinion, it's partially successful in doing that. And I'll try to explain a little bit how Israel is composed. So there's a lot of Jews there, about 6 to 7 million. And I think in America there's more Jews than in Israel, but I'm not sure about the numbers. And in Israel there's also minorities. And the minorities are ethnically Arab. But the Arabs as an ethnic group, like in Lebanon, are, Mark is Phoenician Christian. And in Israel we have Muslim Arabs, we have Christian Arabs with different denominations, we have Druze that also are considered Arabs, we have Bedouins, which are not Arabs, and they're usually Muslim. So it's like a hodgepodge of ethnicity and religion. At the same time, if you look at Jews who live in Israel, like my ancestors came from the Ukraine and Russia. So I'm considered an Ashkenazi Jewish person. Even though my children were born, at least one of them was born in Israel, they're still considered of that descent. And we have Jews that came from Iran, they came from Syria and Lebanon and Morocco and Egypt, and they're basically Jewish from Arab nations. There's European Jews, there's Jews from all over the world. So even between the Jewry, there's different types of ethnicities. So 74% of the citizens in Israel, and that's a special distinction I will go into, the citizens with passports and rights are Jewish. About 21% are Arab, with all the sorts of religions. And then there's a few others who are non-affiliated, Christians who are not Arabs. Many of them came with the Russian immigration. So they're basically people who are not Jewish, they're mostly Christian, they're citizens of Israel, but they're not Arabs, so that's also there. And although in the law we are supposed to treat the minorities with equal rights, that's not the case. The Jews are the dominant part of Israel, and even though the Arab citizens can vote if they live within the confines of Israel, not in the territories, this is a whole different section, and not in East Jerusalem, which was annexed to Israel. So they don't have voting rights, and that's one major key point in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that Israel cannot remain a democratic state if it annexes all of these people, because then it will be, there will be two classes of citizens. And so the territories are still not part of Israel. There's martial law there. So the people who live there are basically, they live in no man's land. Nowadays there's a Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority is not a state. It wasn't recognized as such. So we're discriminating greatly towards the people who live in the territories and in East Jerusalem. And in that sense, the democratic aspects of Israel are really not that strong in that particular thing. I want to touch a little bit about church and state, because if Israel is a Jewish state, then is there a separation between church and state? And is there freedom of religion to the people who are not Jewish? And with respect to freedom of religion, then yes, the Baha'i have their world center in Haifa, and they have another big shrine in Akko, and they're free to come and do their thing, but there is a tacit understanding that they're not going to proselytize, and they're very careful not doing so. So they get freedom as long as they don't interfere with the Jewish state. The Muslims and the Christians can worship freely, but they're discriminated against in more political terms and sometimes economically. There's no Arabs serving in the military. There's no Arabs serving in government, because usually they're excluded from becoming ministers. So there is a separation of church and state in Israel, but it's very delicate. And this is also something that is evolving. New thought is coming along, trying to see how better to define the Jewish nature of Israel and the democratic nature of Israel at the same time. I want to touch a little bit about the conflict with the Palestinians, because that's not really the major key point I want to make. I'm frustrated with this. It's been 50 years since the war that Israel took over the territories. Since then, we've made peace with Egypt, and we've returned some of the territory. We've made peace with Jordan. Lebanon is still there's not a peaceful relationship, and Syria is not a peaceful relationship. And then the whole issue with the Palestinians is still open. There's been many attempts to solve this problem. I think it's possible to solve it if people have the political will to do it. And there has been some attempts, but they were not really very serious. And there's a lot of documentation about who's to blame. There's always somebody to blame, and I think both sides have to blame. I just want to represent a little bit the thought of the Palestinians, even though I'm not Palestinian, is that when they look at Israel from the time of 1948, when Israel was founded, there was a UN resolution to divide what was then Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And then the Arab population at that time of Palestine rejected the proposition of the United Nations, and basically a war ensued in 1948, which was a war that the Jewish people won, and the borders of the first phase of Israel were established. And some of the territory of 1948 Israel contained the part of the Palestinians, or the Arabs of that time, which rejected the resolution. And ever since, Israel was growing a little bit more. It took the Golan Heights from Syria, it took the Sinai from Egypt, and the territories from Jordan. The Gaza Strip was also before Egypt. So the size of Israel has been changing. And in the views of the Palestinians, they already gave up a lot of land. Because all that land that, if you go today to the Galilee area, there's many Arabs there living, which that part was supposed to be Palestine in 1948. So they already gave a lot of land, and they now have nothing. They have only that portion, that little portion in the West Bank, which is the West Bank of the Jordan River. So their mind, they already gave up quite a lot, and now Israel is asking them to give up more land, more resources. There's issues with Jerusalem. There's issues with the claims of Palestinians to return. Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, who is the president of the Palestinian Authority, he was born in Safed, in the Galilee. And when he was a child, 70 years ago, he was basically driven off in that war. So his family has a house there and land and property, and basically he's a first generation refugee, and then he probably has great grandchildren. He's probably 80 or 85. So there's already 3 or 4 generations of refugees. And these people say, we want to come back. So Mahmoud Abbas wants to go back to Safed. But Safed now has been inhabited by Jewish people for 70 years. Other people live in his house. How do you resolve this in a fair way? So this is a thorny issue. Jerusalem is a big thorny issue. You understand that it's claimed by everybody. So it's a very delicate status quo, political, religious. So I think this problem is manageable if the Germans and the French, who killed each other all through the Middle Ages, had made peace, and the Irish and Northern Irish and the Protestants and the Catholic, who are both Christian, were killing each other for many years, and then they made peace. We can also make peace. But unfortunately, right now, there's not a lot of political will on either side, I think, to go there. That's all I'm going to say about this topic. You can ask questions, and I will answer as much as I can. One other thing that interests me a lot is anti-Semitism, and following what happened in Pittsburgh, and which is like an indication, and other things, and we feel that anti-Semitism is on the rise again. And basically I asked myself, I didn't feel this growing up in Argentina, even though it was there. I certainly didn't feel it in Israel growing up. There was no anti-Semitism there. And when I was living in many places around the world, I never felt it. But many of my brothers and sisters did and do still feel it. So I asked myself, why are Jews hated? What is this? Where is this coming from? Because it's real. They are hated. And I started reading a little bit about it, and this is not a conclusive presentation on anything. It really is the tip of the iceberg. But many people accuse them of many things, and when things go wrong, the Jews are to blame because they're spread all around the world. So, for instance, Christians accuse the Jews of killing Jesus, obviously, but Voltaire accused them of inventing Christianity. Jews have been accused of instigating war and being racist and cosmopolitans and inventing communism, and the communists accuse them of creating capitalism. The capitalists accuse them of inventing communism. It's a big mess. I still don't know why Jews are being hated. And I know that, touching a little bit about what I've said yesterday, in the Arab world, especially since 1948, there's been a lot of government propaganda against the Jews. And that has spread along the Muslim world. For instance, with my Israeli passport, I cannot go to visit Widi. There's no diplomatic relations between Israel and Indonesia. I can use my other passport, but and what does the Indonesians have against us? I mean, it's because Islam has been percolating with ideas about the Jews from the Arab world, and it's been spreading for the last, I don't know how many years. So I still don't understand this, but it is something that we have to take into consideration when trying to understand the Jewish culture. This brings me to a point that I would like to share with you is, I think the Jewish conditioning has taken a lot on the victim mentality, especially because of this. And a victim and a perpetrator is basically the two sides of the same coin. So now in Israel of today, we're not really victims. We have a very strong military, we have a flourishing economy, very high standards of living. So we're not a first world nation, but we're getting there. And still, we're having this victim mentality of getting up in the morning and saying, who's going to kill me today? Is the Iranians have the bomb, they want to kill us. The Arab world wants to kill us. BDS wants to banish us. So this mentality of fearing for my life and not really blending in the world, I think is very deep in the Jewish conditioning. And I just wanted to share this with you. And then it goes to the other side. And maybe it's connected, I'm not really sure. Are the Jews the chosen people? That was one of the other questions I asked myself. And if so, then what really happened there? So there's a few quotes here. One from Professor Paul Johnson that said, "No people has ever insisted more firmly than the Jews that history has a purpose and humanity a destiny. At a very early stage in their collective existence, they believed they had detected a divine scheme for the human race, of which their own society was to be a pilot." So this gentleman is an American historian. He wrote a very prominent book about the history of the Jews. At the same time, one of the Jewish rabbis from the 19th century, Rav Kook, he said, "The purpose of the Jewish people, the people of Israel, is to unite the world into one family." And the Urantia Book says, at the same time, "These circumstances rendered it impossible for the Jews to fulfill their divine destiny as messengers of the new gospel of religious freedom and spiritual liberty. They could not break the fetters of tradition. Jeremiah had told of the law to be written in men's hearts. Ezekiel had spoken of a new spirit to live in man's soul, and the psalmist had prayed that God would create a clean heart within and renew a right spirit. But when the Jewish religion of good works and slavery to law fell victim to the stagnation of traditionalistic inertia, the motion of religious evolution passed westwards to the European peoples." So perhaps the Jews did have a role to play. We know for sure that they had a role to play in the evolution of religion, and I'm going to touch that in the next slide. So this brings me a little bit closer to the topic of the symposium. What really has to happen for the Jewish people to accept the Urantia Book and its teachings? And I think, as I was trying to convey to you, there's a lot of conditioning in the psyche of Jewish people. And part of that condition is against Christianity, part of it is against Jesus. That's why it was hard for me, to visit a church, and I had some thoughts about it. Why should I go into the church? But it was just a church, it was just a service. But I could tell that there was something in the back of my mind speaking to me, which of course wasn't mine, it was something that I inherited. And if there's a beautiful story that the Jews are the light and the lights to all nations and the chosen people, which we know perhaps was true 2,000 years ago, but it may not be true anymore. So I think the Jewish people will have to give up a lot of this conditioning on a personal level, things that happened to me, and also on a collective level, to be able to accept these teachings. When I was translating the chapters about Judaism and then the chapters about Jesus, I was thinking I would really like to be a fly on the wall, right, 100 years from now or 200 years from now, and see what people of Jewish descent will think about this when they read it. How is it going to touch them? I'm still interested in that. So that remains to be seen. Will Jewish people give up some of these thoughts and aspirations and beliefs to actually accept the teachings of the Urantia Book? There is now a translation to Hebrew, and I think it's important for the Jews who speak Hebrew, but still there's a lot of work that can be done with Jews all over the world that speak other languages, because the French Jews speak French. This is their native tongue. In Germany, the same. In England, it's English, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like a two-pronged strategy to approach the Jews around the world with the Urantia Book. Those who live in Israel and have Hebrew as their native tongue should enjoy the Hebrew translation, and others can enjoy the other translations and the English source. I do want to say that this is a topic that we'll probably discuss in the synopsis, but it's very important that people have the Urantia Book in their native tongue, in a tongue that they understand. And even in places like the Philippines or in Uganda, where English is a recognized language and even an official language, it doesn't really mean that the mass of the population can enjoy the Urantia book if it's not translated into one of the major tongues of that country. So that's why I think even though Israel is quite small, it's important that the Hebrew translation was made. So, some concrete ideas. I was talking to some Jewish friends, Urantia book readers and others, and what came to my awareness, and of course this also mirrors my own experience, is that one of the main topics that has to do with the Urantia book in part 4, but not only part 4, is Jesus as a person, as an historical figure, as our creator, son, and an elder brother, and especially the revelators tell us quite extensively towards the end of the book, and I have some quotes about this, is that his life and teachings is what we can derive a lot of information about what we need to do now, about how humanity is going to go and transcend this little step that we're talking about on the brink of, and go to the next phase. So I see clearly that my role and what interests me right now, and actually I'm enthusiastic about, is to do things to make the life and teachings of Jesus accessible to Jews at large, either in English or in Hebrew, it doesn't matter what language. And there's two concrete projects that I have in mind. One is, some of you know about a center that I would like to establish on the Sea of Galilee, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. This is actually the location, and this is the quote that I want to read to you, because I think when I went there to this hill and looked down, this is what I felt. That when he was on the cross, when he had a hard time, and they tell us he was remembering the sunsets on the shimmering Sea of Galilee, and that soothed him. His human heart made him strong. So this particular location is on the Mount of Beatitudes, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And my dream is to set up something called the Center for Unity that will have three aspects. A temple, which is a non-denominational temple, and I call it a temple for our Father, and a multimedia center that will expose the teachings of Jesus and his life to all traditions. It's not a Christian place, it's a Jesus place. And a unity library that will study his teachings as they spread around all other traditions since he was here. So something that reflects the spiritual truths in all the other traditions, in order to show us that we're not really, really different. Jews and Christians and Muslims and Hindus and all the other religions. I also have in my heart to start a podcast that I titled The Real Life and Teachings of Jesus. And there I will share my own personal experience with my relationship with Jesus as it evolves, and my understanding of the teachings from the Urantia book. I was inspired to do this also by the work of J.J. Benitez. If some of you read it, it's only available in Spanish, even though there's an English translation. It wasn't published. There's an issue there with Benitez, and he doesn't want it to be published yet. But when I read it in Spanish, I felt one of his books, the Caballo de Troya, basically tells the story of from Palm Sunday all the way to the crucifixion and the resurrection in a great many details. It really brings Jesus to life. You feel it, the human and the divine together, and it's a story, it's fiction, and we're introduced into the story, and we just, we see all the characters playing, and it's beautiful because it really brings him to life. So that was also an inspiration to me. But basically the Urantia book and what we learn from there, to make that accessible to people of the Jewish tradition, of the Muslim tradition, and even of the Christian tradition, who are still bound to whatever is written in the New Testament. And the Urantia Book gives us so much more detail, and it's so much more, it's got a lot of richness. The other thing is study groups in Israel. Sandra and I have started with David, who's a Urantia Book reader, our first study group in Israel. So officially, there may be more, but we don't know about them. I know there's some Russian people who read the Urantia Book in Russian, but I haven't met them yet. So those are our plans to start to make the Urantia Book more accessible to Jews around the world. And this is the rationale, the quotes from the last part of the book, paper 195. And the simple thing is, what would Jesus do? So let's get to know him better. I want to get to know him better so that whenever, like Mark said, I think, whenever we go into a life situation, we don't quote from the Urantia Book, but we actually remember what was his teaching, what he would do. It's a very simple and powerful message. Yeah, so I told you about this, and I think that's it. Yeah.
If I can open this up. Questions?
Yeah. Questions. I have them.
Thanks, Gabriel, for the excellent presentation. Very good. It's challenging, really, to talk about your people. No, it's not easy. Yeah, but what called me the attention now at the end was your idea of building up this center for maybe combining the idea that we are a brotherhood and introducing some of the Urantia teachings on it. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to share the screen again, but the picture I showed you is to those of you who've been to the Sea of Galilee. On the Mount of Beatitudes, there's a chapel, and now there's a big hotel, and it's owned by the Catholic Church. And the Mount of Beatitudes goes from the Sea of Galilee and slowly rises up 200 or 300 or 400 meters. And I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I saw the picture that I just showed you right before getting up in the morning. And I knew it was the Sea of Galilee, but I had no idea what it was. And 2 years later, a friend of ours from Switzerland came, and she asked me to take her to the Sea of Galilee to do some sightseeing. So we bought some lunch, and we went to the chapel in the Mount of Beatitudes, and then we took the car, and she says, let's climb up a hill and just meditate and eat. So we did that. And then when I got to the top of that hill and I looked down, I saw the exact same picture that I saw in my dream 2 years before. So somehow I'm called to that point, and I didn't know exactly what I had to do. It took several more years for this idea to form a little bit more. In the interim, I had discussions with Mo about building a hotel somewhere, and he was very graciously helping me to point me back in the right direction, because I didn't really want to build a hotel. I want to build a temple. So he said, why do you have to have all those people come and feed them and, just to have a temple? And he was right. So no hotel. At the same time, I feel that the words "a temple for our Father," a beautiful place of worship where you can have a spiritual experience built the words that came to me is, if Jesus was here and he would build something like this, I want to build him the way he would build it. From the same materials, using the same techniques, and still make a modern structure that will hold for many generations to come. So there's about 2.5 million Christians going through that area every year. And there's about 3.5 million people coming to Israel, and 2/3 of them self-proclaim themselves to be, in questionnaires, pilgrims. And when we do the statistics, the Ministry of Israel, the tourism, does the statistics of 2.5 million of them come to the Sea of Galilee, and they all go through the same place. They go through Capernaum, they go through Tabgha, they go through Beit Saida, there's ruins there. You have to. The tour operator will take you there. So I'd like that building, that place, to serve as a place where people can come and have a non-intermediate, a direct experience with the teachings of Jesus, as long as they want to. Even if they come for an hour and just sit for a meditation there, I hope for them that they have a spiritual touch of the energy that is imprinted in that area, because many people feel that. This is where he was working with the apostles many, many years, and this is where he lived before and after. So it's a special place. This is as much detail as I have right now. I have a location. The dream is to build something physical there that will give people a spiritual connection with Jesus and his teachings. And this is as far as I got right now.
Thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation. I think that all of us learn a lot about the Jewish culture with what you explained today. I think that the Jewish culture is so important for us, for our Occidental culture, that we can, for example, thank very much the concept of the Jews about nationality. Was the first time in the history of the humankind that we have a concept that it was not binding with the land. This was very important. We have a nationality that comes from a book. I think that this is a seed that in the future we can maybe turn more bright and said that the nationality in Urantia is dependent only from the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood between all the people. It's not only the land or a book, a paper. But I think that the Jews has a big challenge today. And the Urantia Book, this translation to Hebrews, is very important. There are 2 points I think that Urantia Book can help a better future for the Jews and for the world. Because what happens to the Jews happens for all the world. We know this. And for example, the first question is about a temple. It's very dangerous, the situation in Jerusalem, with these questions about the temple. If we build or not, we can call the fourth temple. Urantia Book teaches to us that the temple of God is in us. Maybe if the Jews can think a lot about this, more deep about this. We don't need a material temple. God is in us. This is very important. You have experience with this when we have a nationality that is in paper. Before, when was a Torah or a Talmud, was a Jews, a nationality of Jews. The second point, I think, is about we really try to have peace with the other brothers of the Jews. I think Urantia Book gives you a direction to this. Why we don't try to have an association of the offspring of Abraham, association of the sons of Abraham? Mm-hmm. Maybe if I take and teach all the people that today are different nationalities to talk only about this offspring, we can find a way to the peace. I think that the children can yet more contribute to the future of the human height. It's not maybe.
Can you put it in a question for Gabriel?
Yes, the question, Gabriel, is if you think that it's possible to have this concept in the Jews that the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood between all the sons of God is necessary and is maybe sufficient. We don't need a temple material. We can have it inner. And the second is if it's possible that we can have the association of the offsprings of Abraham. Thank you.
So, very quickly, once the second temple was destroyed, Judaism really transformed into, before when the temple was in operation, many of the religious practices were centered around the temple. The Jews were commanded to come 3 times a year to Jerusalem. Prayer was not as much as after the temple was destroyed. So Judaism transformed. There were no more sacrifices. Prayer and the rabbis became a more dominant part of Judaism. I really don't know why people want to build another temple. I know some people do, but of course it's not possible politically and religiously. And to me, it doesn't make any sense. I agree with you. But I do know that some people connect the coming of the Messiah, which already came, with a temple. So I don't know the answer to that. But of course, it's not happening anytime soon. With respect to the other question, there's already interfaith relationships in Israel. Sandra and I have met people from an organization called the Abrahamic Reunion. It's part of URI. Gard knows more about that. So, and they go around the world and they make peace in Israel, but also they're active around the world. So, yeah, the children of Abraham are already talking and are brothers, and they know their brothers and cousins. It's just that politically and religiously there's still a lot of contention. So I think we're making a little bit of progress, and it's just, we don't have one religion today, we don't have one language today. We know this is where we're going, however long it will take. So those little steps today, Jews becoming more acquainted with Jesus, the Jews and the Muslims and the Druze talking, and the Christians talking together wherever they are, building relationships together, communities together, because we do live together, we live together. So those things are happening in Israel and around the world as well.
Thank you, Gabriel. Now, I've read or heard about the Jews. In the Urantia book, we have they elevated Abraham so that the concepts of Melchizedek were not so elevated. According to the Bible, we have a few. They didn't include more of Melchizedek's teachings. They instead uplifted Abraham instead. I'm looking at the Jews being so proud that they don't wish to perpetuate other people's concepts, but theirs. So I'm wondering if, with that kind of prospect of, let's say, maybe ingrained in them that, they are superior over the others, do you think they would be happy to accept the Urantia book? Or have it within their culture as well, adopt it? That's my wonder, yeah.
I wonder the same thing, but I can tell you that just like it happened to me, I can tell you about my experience. I know I have this conditioning inside of me of the chosen people, blah, 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 but it wasn't strong enough. So when there was an opening and the Urantia book came into my life, other people said it here. I started reading, and very quickly I had to decide if this is true or not. So I decided it's true, even though I don't understand many of it, and I don't, I cannot prove much of it. I believe that whatever is written in the Urantia book is true, and then from that, I could do, or a transformation happened to my psyche, whereas a whole set of beliefs about Judaism and other beliefs that I had, reincarnation, were cast aside, and then something else could take their place. So I imagine people reading the Urantia book when they're ready, and especially in another era that we're all preparing to, when spirituality is going to have more place in people's lives, and they're going to be more open to it, like the publication mandate says. In that era, I think people are going to, it's going to be easier for them to give up many of the beliefs that they had about being the chosen people and about Jesus, yes, being the Messiah, not being the Messiah, who is the Messiah, all those things that we read in the Urantia book that the Jews at that time, at the time he was living, had a very big issue with. And they missed it. Those who made those decisions, not the population who went and accepted the teachings, but the authorities of the religious authorities, the Sanhedrin, many of them rejected it on a personal basis, but they made a decision for everybody else. So, and it's a fatalistic decision. I think it's an individual process, and people will go through their process, reading the Urantia book, getting to know more about Jesus, and then making their own decisions.
Comment on that, and then it goes to Mark.
I read that the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah. What do you say about that?
Yeah, they're still waiting because they missed the last train, so.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I really learned a lot. I just wanted to ask you, on a personal level, how do you approach a Jewish person with the Urantia book? First, in Israel, and then the Jewish people who live outside of Israel, for example, in the United States or elsewhere. I can imagine that those who live outside are more open to other ideas, but the ones that live in Israel could be more orthodox. I don't know, I'm just guessing here. So what do you think? So what is your personal approach if you want to get the Urantia book to a Jewish person?
I usually let myself be guided on a personal basis. So when I meet somebody and the conversation goes to the topics of interest that concern spirituality, then eventually I just sense and I ask for guidance. What does this person need? And if it's a person that is very scientific and is very philosophical, and I might say something about, what do you think about this question? What is your opinion? And then I might say, when he asks me about my opinion, I can share some teachings of the Urantia book. I usually don't mention the book right away. I just let it to be a process where somebody's asking, and then sometimes I do say, there's something like this, but it's a very personal thing. I don't have an approach per se.
Would you say that they accept such ideas, or would you say that they are conservative? They push you away, or I don't know. I really have no idea.
It's really personal. I talk to many people about the Urantia book. I know there's Jewish people reading the Urantia book. There's a New Age type of community. They're reading in English. They didn't know there was a translation. I have a Facebook page for the translation in Hebrew, and I used to post the daily quote from the foundation translated to Hebrew. I did that for a year or two, and then people see it, and they approached me and said, "Is it in Hebrew?" And we have a discussion. But it's really very personal. I think whoever needs to read the book will find it and will be open to it. And as we know, this is not for everybody. So sometimes when people say, when they ask where this is from, I say, no, this is not for everybody. So if you really feel called, I will share this information with you. But you don't have to read it, and it's really up to you. So I really let the other person make the effort. I rarely give somebody a book. I don't think that's, if they don't ask for it.
Is it okay from the periphery here that I ask a question? Oh, thank you. Brief comment. First, Marilyn and I were in Israel with Diane's first trip when we met Gabriel in 2014, and the site that he took us to is indeed quite lovely, and the view from there is breathtaking. If I come back, I do hope I can get up and down the hill without killing myself, though it was a difficult climb. The question is, I'm not perfectly informed in this, but I remember a few months ago the Israeli government passed some kind of law declaring that it was a Jewish state. Was that new, or was that just a more of an entrenchment? Is that more of an obstacle now? Is it part of what is going on around the world with people kind of turning inward nationally? And do you know what I'm talking about? It seemed like it was a fairly significant step at that time.
It's called the law or the national law, and it was passed by right-wing. There's a right-wing government in Israel for a long time, and usually I didn't talk about the political system, but there's about 10% of the population who are Orthodox, and they vote for Orthodox religious parties. And also there's Zionist religious parties that also are usually a right-wing. And because there was a majority in the parliament for something like this, then they drafted a law that many people think it's not necessary, which tries to restate the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, which is part of the Declaration of Independence. And it caused a lot of friction with the minorities, especially with the Druze. Mark told you about Druze in Lebanon. The Druze they're basically an esoteric little cult of Islam. They had their own prophet and their own religion, basically. The Druze in Israel decided to ally themselves with Israel since 1948. They serve in the military. They're full-blown citizens in Israel. They are trusted. So there's an alliance between the Jews and the Druze for 70 years. And this was a blow for them, because this law basically says, yes, it's a Jewish state and everybody else is a second-grade citizen, because we don't really treat you as equals. Even though the Constitution, another Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the basic laws in Israel put in writing that everybody is equal to the law. So it was like poking the eye of the minorities, and I don't understand why they did it. I don't agree with it, but it was done because of this impulse to ascertain again we are a Jewish state. If you have to tell somebody something instead of living it, then there's a problem with you. So there's no need to say it again and write it again. Everything was already happening the way it should be for Israel as a Jewish state before. So I don't understand the rationale for this law. But it was put to paper.
Sandra had a question as well.
Yeah. My insight about the suspicion and hate from the Islamic country, from the Muslim to Jews, is that because for me as Indonesians, we identify ourselves with the Palestinians. That's the main problem. And the main problem is because in the Quran itself, in the Islamic teaching, we are taught that the Jews are the enemy. They are enemies. So this is embedded very deep. And but this is a matter of interpretation also, because some clerics have a moderate interpretation. Our former president is a cleric, visited Israel, no problem. But some clerics that are fundamentalists, that are conservative, they hate the Israel very much. But if the Jews want to be light to the world, light to all nations, the first they must do is to end the conflict with the Palestinians. That is.
I agree. I wrote in my paper, which you have, that I don't think Israel has been living up to this very high standard of being a light to all nations in the first 71 years of its existence. But at the same time, you know, this victim mentality says that, and I had this discussion with one of you, that when people criticize the deeds of the Israeli government, then the Israelis say this is anti-Semitism. No, it's not anti-Semitism. It's criticism, which sometimes is warranted. But the defensive part of the Jews says, no, you cannot criticize us. We're right. And that is a closed mind mentality that many Israelis have. You know, we go in the world saying we have to fight for our survival, and that means we're an aggressor, which is the flip side of the victim mentality. The perpetrator and the victim is two sides of the same coin. I know I was reading a little bit about what Muhammad said in the Quran about the Jews. There were things happening around that time when Islam was starting in Saudi Arabia and Mecca, Medina, and all those, and there was Jews there. So Muhammad had some relationships with the Jews, and some of them were against Islam. They didn't want to take Islam. But like you said, it's a matter of interpretation. Some people say whatever the Quran says is that the Jews are the enemy, and other people say no, it's really, it happened that time, in that context, and it was written 1,500 years ago or whatever, 1,400 years ago. And today it's something different. So I hope the moderates have their way and there could be peace.
I wanted to make a comment, and after a question, what you said, Mark. In my impression, in the little time I've been in Israel, the times I also visit Israel, is that first of all, I think that there's this impression that there's a lot of Orthodox, or the majority of the population in Israel is Orthodox and very conservative, and I've seen it's not, and they also live really in peace, and like people, they're Orthodox walking around, and also people that are not Orthodox, 10%, as Gabriel said, is Orthodox. My impression is also that the people in Israel, there's a lot of people really with a hunger of truth, of something else. My impression is that the Judaism has not been giving people there what really they're looking for in terms of spirituality, or feeding this hunger of knowing. And people are going in many kinds of alternatives, like Hinduism and yoga and New Age. So I want to know if it's also that your impression, or what are your comments about that?
Well, I didn't search for truth in Judaism, so I cannot say it's not there. I think it is there. But like in other religions, I think it's covered with many layers of dogma and beliefs. And when you're not guided by somebody who knows the truth of that tradition, to find it by yourself is quite hard. So I never even tried. I was called to do other things. So and now I'm coming back, and Sandra and I watched a video of somebody teaching the Zohar, which is an esoteric Kabbalistic book in Israel, and then he was explaining things that I don't know. And he was talking about the female and the male and many different supreme and many different concepts that are there in the esoteric aspects of Judaism, which we know from other places, from the Urantia Book and other traditions. So I think the truth is there, and it's a very individual matter if somebody who's seeking for truth will find it in their own tradition or will find it in some other tradition. For me, it happened that I went through other traditions.
The Course in Miracles for the Chinese community started in San Francisco, Akora readers, and then it spread to Taiwan, and then the Taiwanese introduced it into mainland China. And today there are over 80 study groups in mainland China. So in Israel, there are 6.5 million Jewish people. In the state of New York, there are 2 million Jewish people. Do you think that same concept of migration from New York would work into Israel? There are a number of Urantia Book readers in New York that have a Jewish heritage, and they've accepted the Urantia Book teachings religiously and spiritually, but not culturally. They still keep their Jewish culture. So what do you think about that possibility?
For me, the key point was Jesus. And even today, we had a meditation this morning, and we finished the meditation, and Gard said a prayer, and he said, "Jesus, our Lord." I heard those words, and something in me still struggles with that. Somebody, another Urantia Book reader who is a dear friend, gave me a cross with the 3 concentric circles, and he says, "You're an ambassador. Wear this." And I said, "I cannot wear this. It's bothering me." And I still have it. No, it's on my desk in my office, but something there with Jesus is still creating resistance in me. That's why I want to start with this. Make him and his teachings more accessible, so that the cultural aspects of Judaism can expand to include his teachings. I don't care about Christianity. I'm not there to promote Christianity. So I think that is a stumbling block for me. It might be for others. And some of the Urantia Book readers, the Jewish people I talked to, said the same thing to me. They're having some troubles with Jesus. As even though intellectually, like I know who he is. I believe that with all my heart. But when I implement, like from the mind to the heart, there's still some difficulty there, and I'm still struggling with that. So for me, this is a step I have to take, and I think many other Jews might have the same problem. But it sounds like a good strategy. I don't know why it didn't happen so far. It's not because of the translation. I think it's because of other things, but we should ask those people why they didn't make an effort to spread it around. I don't know.
I just want to make a quick comment before I hand it to Jean, because I have a lot of Jewish colleagues and dear, dear friends that I work with in the city, this is New York City, that have no interest in the Urantia Book, but ask me a lot of questions about some of the information. They know I read it, they know I study it. I mean, it's a psychology group, so we're talking about bereavement and life after death and et cetera, et cetera. But they would no more hear anything about Jesus. And yet, I must say that some of them celebrate Christmas because they like the rituals. But, you know, I do think that the concept of connecting with the Jewish, really the ethnic people, or who identify themselves culturally, is they will connect back with Israel, and I think it's an option. I mean, I think it's a good option. But again, as all of you have said many, many times, it's meeting somebody where they are with the questions that they have, and loving them in those questions, and responding to what their soul is asking. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have two, well, maybe two questions. One is, I live in Skokie, which is, I don't know now, but before it used to be Jewish community. And I've seen Jews for Jesus. It's a group. They actually have an office there. I was thinking of going there and give them whatever, Urantia, but I haven't really had the courage yet to go there, because I really don't know, you know. But I'm just wondering if you know about that, because that might be a good, you know, good, among the Jewish, I think that would be a good to approach them, right? Because they're already into Jesus. Well, that's one. And second one is, how many Jews you think are all over the world who identified as Jewish, or aside from Israel? I'm just wondering if you have that idea.
I don't have exact numbers, but it's about 15 million around the world, with the United States and Israel being the two major centers. And then there's Argentina, Europe, France, Germany, less. But the Arab countries already have no Jews. The Jews were expelled from there last century. So Europe, there's still some in Russia. About 15 million, I think that's the number. And with the Messianic Jews and those groups, yes, you're right. There are people in Israel, Jews that are called Messianic Jews. They believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and they believe in him personally. And they're not Christian. So it's a Jewish person that accepts Jesus as the Messiah, and then whatever teachings they take from the New Testament, because they don't have another source. And with the Urantia book, they may have a more realistic. So yeah, that's for sure. I really hope that I can make acquaintance with more and more people like that.
Do you think it might be good for me to give them a Urantia book? Or?
I think you should pray, and the answer will come.
Oh, just for your information, in the Second World War, or before that, one of the recipients of the Jewish people is the Philippines. And so there are few Jewish people who went there, and actually some of them became industrialists, you know. Like, I'm just wondering, Ismail is like Jewish, right? There's an Ismail still, but I'm not so sure. I have to research on that.
Actually is the word for the non-Jewish.
Ismail
was the other son of Isaac, the son who created, according to tradition, all the Arab peoples.
Arab.
Yes, but it's a biblical name, so.
Okay, but yeah, there's still Jewish there. And there are some temples there too. Yeah.
If you want to connect me to them, that would be great.
So, Gabriel, I'm curious, what is the general concept of how the Messiah is going to manifest, and what will be the role of the Jewish people? Is there a general one? Is there a variety? Do they anticipate this still? I'm really curious about that.
I think the Urantia book talks a lot about, in many aspects, what Jesus was facing, because he didn't really fulfill the expectations of being a temporal ruler and saving temporally, physically, the people of Israel from the yoke of the Roman occupation. And he knew he wasn't that, so he had to come to terms with the fact that, yes, he was a divine visit, he was an incarnation, a divine son, and I personally think that all those prophecies were talking about him, but then some aspects about the temporal, being the king of Israel and being a descendant of David and all those things, he did not fulfill. So that's why he was rejected, among other things. So I think those expectations, those prophecies, for the people who think they were not fulfilled, they're still to be fulfilled. And they're looking for somebody who will go along those lines, somebody who will save Israel, will be a temporal ruler as well as a spiritual ruler, and then there will be other manifestations, spiritual manifestations of the Messiah coming. I don't know much about this, but I do know that the very Orthodox people say until every person in the Jewish nation is fulfilling all the laws of the Torah, the Bible, that will not happen. So there has to be it's called a tikkun, a correction, where individually all the Jews are as best as they can be before the Messiah comes. So it's like, it's always a very high bar, and we're not there, so it's okay that he didn't come. It's because I'm not keeping kosher, it's because I drive on the Shabbat, or whatever. So they might look at me and say, you're Jewish, you have an obligation to do this and this and this and this, so that the Messiah can come. And until you do your thing, he won't come. So I think he won't come.
I'd love you to speak a little bit more about anti-Semitism, because I do think it's a huge problem, and I think it's growing in the world, and I think the more unstable the world is becoming, the more that fear is getting projected onto Jews, and it concerns me.
As I said, I started reading, and I don't understand. There's people say a lot of things about that. I really don't know why it is happening. There was one thing I read which didn't make a lot of sense to me, but like if the Jews are the chosen people and they're supposed to correct themselves so that the world can be corrected and be a light to all nations and all those things, then maybe because we're not doing it individually and collectively, then we're responsible for many of the bad things that happen in the world. I don't subscribe to that. I wrote it in my paper somewhere, I don't remember, but the quote is that when there was the Babylonian exile and most of the Old Testament was written at that time, the Jews were in a very depressive state, and the Bible, for the most part, was written to elevate. It wasn't really written as a scripture at the time. I read it somewhere. It was written to put the Jews through a very hard period of transition when they were in exile, and to uplift them. And then it became later to be known as the Word of God, and people take it literally. And that was not the intention of the people who wrote it. So in there, they also decided to designate the Jews as the chosen people of Yahweh. And at that point, Yahweh was more like a tribal god. And the Urantia Book shows us what was the evolution of Yahweh, and says that that was one of the major contributions of Judaism, that they took the concept of a tribal, ferocious God of Mount Sinai to the concept of a loving Father, creator of all things. So that was a contribution of Judaism. And that was very important. They say that this transformation, this religious transformation, was not done before on Urantia. So I guess those people who wrote the Bible and designated the people of Israel as lights to all nations, they try to uplift the Jewish people when it was a hard time, and many people just take it literally. They say this is the word of God, and so from there you can take action. Or
when I live in France and in Europe, there is a anti-Semitism is going up, and there are a lot of young criminals, young people, who think the Jews have always money in their home and they're very rich. So they attack them or they come and steal their things. That's the first thing. And I think the second thing is there are many, all over Europe, groups of extreme right, which have the same ideology as before the Second World War. So all this mix of the two things makes, in Europe, I think, the problem with anti-Semitism at the moment.
Gabriel, thank you. Thursday evening, we had Jonathan Weisman from the New York Times in Las Vegas talking about anti-Semitism and the rise of it. He said a couple things that were interesting to me. One, he said, just wait, because my daughter has a very different perspective than my generation. And she's not necessarily so pro-Israel or the policies of the state. And he said, this is true of a lot of millennials and Gen Xers, that you will see an increasing sort of separation and a desire to see a separation of church and state with that generation. So that was the first piece. The other piece he said was this idea of scapegoating. He said, maybe America ought to look at its own Palestinians. Maybe Canada ought to look at its own Palestinians. Maybe Australia look at their own Palestinians, which are not Palestinians. They're Native Americans, they're Aboriginals, they are people who have been displaced. And there's plenty of work to be done in our own backyard. But for whatever reason, the Jews have been scapegoated in a huge way, and they have sort of carried that burden. But as Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu said in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have plenty of work to do in our own backyard.
Okay, any other questions or last minute thoughts that anyone would like to add to Gabriel's fabulous presentation? Good? Okay. Thank you.